Alright, so let me look at the screen, huh? Alright, so we got plenty of suspension travel now. Taking the bump stops off, it's fine. Got all the room in the world. So, next episode we'll do the air shocks. Alright, so before we get into this, I thought it's important to address some misinformation around air shocks and give you guys the information I have. I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, and I saw air shocks used improperly that whole time, and I grew up hearing that air shocks are terrible, they suck, they ride like crap, don't do it, you'll be sorry, all of it. But here's the thing. When used the way they're supposed to be used, and used for what they're designed for, air shocks are the perfect solution for a situation like my truck has. Now, I've run air shocks on basically every lowered mini truck I've ever owned, and that's because I want to still use it as a truck. I want to be able to throw an engine block in the back or have a bunch of people jump in the back of it and not be dragging the back bumper down the road or have the axle sitting directly on the frame. Now, that's what air shocks are designed for, which is basically for load control. Air shock is not designed to be your suspension. They're not designed to replace your springs. People will take a car with, let's say, sagging springs on it in the back. You know, the car's dragging the rear bumper because the suspension is broken or drooping. And you can use an air shock to bring your vehicle back up to stock height if you're only dealing with maybe like an inch of sag. If you go beyond that, what happens is they get very harsh. And the reason for that is because you're having to increase the air pressure within the airbag. So it's basically a shock absorber with an airbag around it, kind of like the ones that I think it was it Ride Tech or AccuAir or one of those companies sells, I forget what they call them. It's a similar idea, not quite the same. Those have larger airbags. The more capacity they have, the better the job they do of cushioning your ride. Air shocks, because they're fit inside of the bag, is fit around the shock and inside the housing. It's a very small amount of air that actually goes into the bag. So it's not the same as running airbags, for starters. Okay, secondly, an air shock isn't supposed to be pumped with 150 pounds of pressure so that you can jack the back of your car way up and stick big giant tires that hang out past the fenders, which is what everyone was doing in the 70s and 80s. Before, you know, mini tubbing and things like that, and the same with wheels too. It wasn't as easy to get wheels with the perfect offsets like it is nowadays. You didn't have a lot of choice, so if you wanted to put an N50, which would be like a, I don't know, like a 295 width tire on a car back then, and you didn't have the race resources, so to speak, to cut down your wheel well or cut down your rear axle and modify your wheel wells, move the frame rails, and do all that stuff. It just wasn't commonplace yet. So most people would buy an air shock, pump a whole bunch of air pressure into it, raise the car up 6 or 7 inches in the back, and then jam these giant tires under it. So that's where it got its bad reputation. The air shock got the reputation of riding really harshly, and yeah, if you do that, it will ride harshly. And that's the reality. I'm not explaining that well, but the air shock is just supposed to help your suspension. It's not supposed to replace it. But when you put 150 pounds of pressure in it or more and you crank it way up with no load on it, especially if you've got a car that you've lightened for drag racing or something, then that shock has no suspension travel whatsoever, basically, at that point. It's too stiff for the weight of the vehicle, and you're going to feel every bump and bottle cap in the road because you're not going to have any suspension travel. That shock's going to be rigid, and it's not going to want to move. The other problem is people use them to level out their vehicles and set the ride height where they want it. And that's fine, like I said before, if you've got a little bit of a weak suspension and you just need to adjust it about an inch, raise your car up about an inch to make it look right, you'll be okay because you're probably only putting 50, 60 pounds in the shock at that point. And it's still going to work like a shock. But it will ride harshly if you do that. The reason I put air shocks in all my lowered trucks is because I want to still use it as a truck. And that is actually what they're designed for, and they worked perfectly in this application. And I'm saying this because I know how much misinformation there is about air shocks out there, and I know that there's going to be a billion comments. Well, I only have a few hundred subscribers, so there won't be a billion comments, but somebody invariably always puts air shocks suck, don't use air shocks, and then everybody who doesn't know is confused. So that's why I'm saying all this right now and getting long-winded about it. But for our uses, what you do is you get it all loaded up, the back of the truck drops, and then you put in enough air to bring it back up to basically where it sits without a load in it. And by doing so, you're only putting on as much air pressure as you need to compensate for the extra weight you're putting in the vehicle. And when you do that, it doesn't change the way they feel. That's what we're doing on the truck. We're putting the air shock in there. I put a few pounds of pressure in it whenever I need to level out a load, if I got something going in the back of it, and it rides perfect. I know this from experience. Like I said, I've done it to every lowered vehicle I've ever had. And you'll also notice in here I do another thing, and I did it on the Nissan as well in that build. I tend to put the shocks on more of an angle, and I do that by flipping the plates. So what I've done is I've taken the passenger side spring mounting plate, which is this guy here, that has the shock mount built onto it. I've taken the passenger side one, put it on the driver's side, and taken the driver's side one and put it on the passenger side. And what that does is it makes the shock mount, instead of being mounted here behind the axle center line, it's now mounted here in front of the axle center line. And it's about a 2-inch difference in mounting location. So let's just check that real quick, because we can eyeball it pretty close. So right now my installed length is 18¼ inches from eye to eye. Now if I was to move that shock back to here, to where it would be from the factory, we're looking at about 16 3/8. 16, maybe even 16¼ So we picked up well over an inch is what I'm trying to say, almost 2 inches of length here once it's installed. If this pin was still back here, we wouldn't have this clearance up here on the shock like we do now. And my shock's maximum travel so far in all conditions that I've put it through, it travels to about here, which leaves us only about 3/4 of an inch. So if this installed height was an inch shorter, we would be bottoming out our shock. So this was kind of a necessity in order for me to run stock length air shocks on a lowered vehicle. If I drop it another inch, we'll be fine, because this shock won't compress another full inch. Because of this angle, it's only going to compress about an extra ½ an inch. But I will be getting pretty close to bottoming that thing out. Another advantage is it lays the shock back on a sharper angle. And by doing that, what we're doing is we're lessening the amount of travel that the shock has to undergo for the same amount of travel in the suspension itself. The suspension is going to travel up and down, but if I was to compress this 2 inches and raise it up, this shock would only move itself, the shock would only travel about 1 inch. Because this is basically, let's call that a 45 just for the sake of easy math. So that is another advantage. By doing that, the shock is moving less distance in the same amount of time for the same amount of suspension travel. That, in effect, softens the feel of the shock absorber because there's less fluid or gas, depending on what kind of shock you're running, being forced through the valve in that same time span. It doesn't soften it a noticeable amount. The main reason for doing this is just to gain that extra installed length. So I'm not so old that I'm shaking that bad. I'm doing that on purpose so that the bolts can drop down into the shock without me reaching up and pushing them through with my other hand. It was a goofy angle for me to reach up with my left hand. So just jiggle the shock a little, let the bolts drop through. That's all that's going on there. Alright, it's hard to see the jack stand behind the floor jack, but the truck is being supported at the frame by jack stands. The floor jack itself is just there as an extra safety precaution. But by drooping the suspension, it allows me to extend the shock to mount it, which allows you to get to the nuts on the upper mount much easier. If you try to install it compressed, you can't really get a socket or a wrench around it very easily. So it's just a little tip. If you droop the suspension, this shock installs a lot easier. It's close there, but it's plenty far away, because as the suspension comes up, which is what it's going to do when I put it back on its own weight, that'll actually move away. So we're good. Alright, just a quick note, because I didn't realize what it looked like on camera, but I made sure that I ran that line far away from any heat sources, because it looks like it's getting close to the exhaust there, but it's actually not even remotely close to it. It just looks that way in that angle. You want to not run it too close to an exhaust pipe or a muffler or anything like that. You also want to keep it away from anything that might pinch it on the exhaust while your suspension is moving around. So there's a bump stop like this that goes here, where I could adjust the mounting position of this to where this becomes the new bump stop. That would keep that, you know what I mean? Give that right there something to hit on. It's actually a pretty good idea, because initially I was going to put it right there. Alright. I think that's what I'm going to do. So I know where to stop. I'm going to stick this on there. Where it goes. Figure out where it goes. Alright, so I just got to run it in to that black mark. Alright, so I can't get it to fit with the cap, but got it to line up perfectly right there, so we just won't put a cap on it. It's going to be resting up against this flat spot on the door. It's not going to get much in the way of dirt in there, and I just clean it out once in a while. Alright, that is basically what it's going to look like. Perfect. I'll tighten that once I get the lines finalized. Alright, so if you don't know, cap goes on first. And then this little thingamajigger, whatever this is, that goes on like that. Fat end at the bottom there. There you go. And then 2 O-rings. Give yourself a little bit extra there, and that's going to get jammed down into the fitting. Alright, let's do this. I'm sticking my head in the way. I probably totally am. Alright, if I did that right, finger tight should be enough. Yeah, that works. It's not pretty. I don't like this flopping ass thing hanging there, but I could always stick another magnet thing right there. So I'll be using these guys, and this is not a plug because I'm sponsored or endorsed. I bought these years ago, but I love them. And as a matter of fact, this package has lasted me forever. Only got a few left. It's got some plastic clips on the top, a rare earth magnet that sticks really well. You just clip that on there and stick it to the body and pop your line in there. And that'll hold it. So no more line flopping around. Okay. There we go. Alright, so there they are. They're laying in there cleanly. I'm going to zip tie them to that. Then they come over to that Mag Daddy magnet. It's holding them to the outer skin of the truck, and then there is our T-fitting. It had to go up and down instead of side to side because of the proximity to the, filling neck. Alright, I'm going to put the minimum required 25 pounds of pressure in these airbags for now. Let's see if it keeps it tight or if it starts to come up. And let's see if we can properly do this. Okay. Sounds like the bladder's settled into their position. Alright, that's about 8 pounds according to the gauge. Alright, that's 28 pounds, so that's about as high as I'm going to have to worry about it being. Alright, so the little truck made it back from the swap meet, flea market? I think it was called the flea market. The air shocks did their job. I had a much better ride than we've been having. Got a few more things stuffed in there. So yeah, little truck did good, and she's back now. So thanks so much for watching. See you next time. No, I mean it this time.